Here on our channel, people's stories come to life. Stories from different eras, professions, and destinies. Each of them follows their own path, their own life woven from circumstances, challenges, and choices. Before we step into their world, make sure to subscribe, and later, share your impressions in the comments. Now, let's begin. Some stories don't start with loud events. They start small, with details, with moments that seem insignificant, yet hold entire worlds within them. These are stories about people who never chose to be heroes. They simply lived, worked, made mistakes, learned from them, and kept moving forward. The lives of such people unfold like a slowly blooming flower, each petal revealing itself in its own time, each layer hiding new secrets, new pains, new joys. This is a story from a time when the world was just a little different. The courtyard where the child first opened her eyes to the world was narrow, pale, and filled with the sound of other people's lives. At dawn, when the washerwomen stepped into the yard, the stone floor glittered with wet linen that carried the smell of soap and fatigue. Pigeons cooed between the tiles above, and a faint gray glow hinted that another day, much like the one before, had begun. She lived there with her parents in a single room whose door opened onto that same courtyard. The father, a cobbler with calloused fingers, worked at a wooden bench by the window. The rhythm of his hammering became the household's heartbeat. Around him, scraps of leather curled on the floor like fallen leaves. The mother, thin and reflective, spent her hours sewing for wealthy homes. Her thread moved quickly through cloth, whispering of other people's tables, dresses, and celebrations, things that would never cross their own threshold. The girl often sat on the doorstep, watching the sky appear as a sliver between rooftops. It seemed like a private world, tiny, smoky, framed by yellow walls. She had a sense that Madrid was vast, yet she only knew the alleys where bread was cheap and fresh water was carried from the well. On market days, she walked behind her mother, memorizing the smells. Olives in wooden barrels, candles of cheap tallow, oranges bright as coins. She would lower her eyes when gentlemen passed, but watched their polished boots long after. It was the parish priest who first noticed her quickness. He caught her mouthing the Latin of the evening prayers and asked, amused, whether she understood what she whispered. She did not, but she loved the sound of it, as if it came from far away and meant something good. From then on, she was allowed to linger near the sacristy when the priest wrote his letters. He would read them aloud, names of places across the ocean, matters of the bishop and the missions, and she began to recognize how voice turned to meaning through signs on the page. When rain fell, it drummed against the window panes and soaked the courtyard. On such days, her mother sighed that shoes could not be delivered, and her father cursed softly because leather cracked in damp air. The girl felt the closeness of their troubles as something natural, a kind of weather of the soul. Yet she also felt a private brightness, a tenderness that language brought her. Even the smallest prayers or the labels on a jar seemed like treasures. She would trace the letters again and again, drawing them into dust with her finger. At night, the family's candle burned down early. She watched its small flame lean and stutter in the draught while her parents dozed. The silence of the courtyard after dark was almost holy. Once, late in winter, She lifted a Bible borrowed from the priest and sounded out whole phrases until her throat ached. The candle smoked gently. Soot marked her hand. She did not understand the words, but she sensed that they carried power beyond the reach of hand or coin. The years slid quietly past, one task folding into another. By the time she was nearly grown, her father's sight had weakened from constant strain. He taught her how to cut leather for soles, and she obeyed, though her eyes followed the pages of books whenever work allowed. Her mother predicted, half with pride and half with fear, that she would leave the courtyard one day. That phrase stayed in her mind like a promise wrapped in warning. One summer morning, the priest sent for her. She went to the parish house with trembling hands, expecting to be scolded for some clumsy mistake. Instead, he placed before her an old Latin manual used by young clerks and said she might keep it. In that moment, she felt a warmth almost painful. Learning had always been borrowed, snatched in moments. Now it had weight and smell, paper and ink. The book's pages carried notes in a fine hand, long faded. Its cover had softened at the edges like worn cloth. Through those lessons, new sounds came to dwell in her memory. Amare, credere, sperare. To love, to believe, to hope. They glowed quietly in her thoughts as she worked, as she fetched water, even as she knelt to wash the floor. She began to picture work not as punishment, but as the rhythm beneath something higher. The notion that words could lift her from drudgery became both comfort and sustenance. Still, she sensed the weight of her station. Neighbors teased her for speaking like a little lady. Sometimes she let laughter hide her shame, yet she held those words closer, protecting them like coins in a pocket. She knew the city had invisible borders. Behind shuttered balconies, ladies played piano to the scent of jasmine, while in the courtyard, bread was flavored with ash. Her heart swung between envy and wonder. The first time she glimpsed the wider city was when her mother sent her to deliver a parcel to a seamstress employed by the Marchioness of Alcomendris. The coachmen shouted at one another in polished accents, and even the cobblestones seemed cleaner there. She caught fragments of other tongues, French, perhaps Italian, and felt something awaken. If one could understand those voices, perhaps one might also cross into that brightness. Back home, she told her parents she wanted to learn more languages. Her father frowned but said nothing. Her mother, though proud, warned her that cleverness could make a woman seem dangerous. She took the warning to heart. Later, she learned to smile quietly and speak simply, masking the restless thoughts that crowded her sleep. As evening settled over Madrid, the courtyard filled again with the scrape of buckets and children's cries. Above the alleys, chimney smoke softened the last light. She gazed at it from the doorway and felt a small certainty. Somewhere beyond this walled square lay a larger pattern waiting to be read, like foreign script waiting for translation. That feeling would accompany her for decades, through service, pride, betrayal, and the quiet freedom that follows understanding. But that lay far ahead, unseen. For now, the girl folded her Latin book and blew out the candle, falling asleep to the irregular breath of her parents and the soft drip of water through the courtyard's cracked tiles. Morning broke with the dull scrape of shutters and the smell of boiled coffee drifting from the courtyard below. The governess, not that she would have dared call herself so yet, folded her single dress from the previous day and fastened the only decent collar she owned. The widow's house stood on a quieter street, where carriages passed rare and slow, leaving behind streaks of mud that servants hurried to wash away before noon. It was her first true place. Years had carried her from that childhood courtyard into small positions: companion to an elderly aunt, helper in a modest school. But this was her first household of standing. She rose early, dressed swiftly, and stepped into the polished silence of the corridor. Every object here seemed deliberate: silver frames on dark walnut tables, worn carpets brightened by candlelight, a painted clock ticking with the dignity of habit. Her duty was to guide a niece in reading and penmanship. The girl was pale, dreamy, with a fondness for stories, but a restless mind. Together, they traced letters across rough paper, dipped into fables, copied from handbooks, and repeated little sayings in French. The governess knew only what she had learned from others' fragments: a borrowed grammar, a pamphlet kept hidden in an old shawl. Yet as she instructed, her voice grew steady, and she felt almost for the first time the quick pulse of authority. From the window she could glimpse the orange trees that shaded the courtyard below. Servants crossed it in pairs, heads bowed, carrying trays or baskets of linen. Sometimes she felt herself part of them, and other times apart, floating somewhere between the scullery and the drawing room, belonging fully to neither. That strange uncertainty was perhaps the mark of every governess. In the beginning, the widow favored her. "A sensible girl," she said, though rarely to her face. The woman's eyes followed every movement, even while pretending to read scripture. She kept a small bell by her chair and rang it for trifles: more sugar in the tea, more firewood, fewer questions. The governess learned to answer with quiet composure, folding her thoughts into measured phrases. There was another servant, a young man assigned to errands and sweeping the courtyard. He had quick hands and an easy grin, the kind of confidence born from assuming no one watched. He spoke warmly to her when no one listened, not improper, but enough to stir the air around her name. Once, when she laughed at a small joke, he whispered that she looked too proud to be scrubbing ink from little hands. She turned away, half amused, half uneasy, and tried to forget the remark. Weeks passed. Lessons grew predictable. The niece recited poems. The widow dozed, and the governess measured her hours by the angle of light across the tiled floor. She grew accustomed to the shape of quiet dignity, moving softly through rooms scented with lavender and starch. But something in her still clung to alertness, the instinct of one who must never trust comfort entirely. One evening, she took the child's grammar to her room to review. The small attic chamber was cold enough to cloud her breath. She sat by a stub of candle and noted vocabulary in the margins. Words flowed under her pen: loisir, leisure; méfiance, distrust; espérance, hope. When she signed her name after a passage, she felt a faint pride, the handwriting even, the meaning clear. For the first time she sensed that her growing skill might become her livelihood, perhaps even her protection. It was the letter that changed everything. A relative of the widow had written from Toledo, and the governess, being the only one capable of penning a suitable response, was asked to assist. She composed the draft late at night, polite and concise, thanking the family for their concern and recounting the household's peace. When she finished, she laid the sheet upon her table and went to sleep. The next day the paper was gone. 2 days later, Whispering began among the servants, her name joined with laughter, the rhythm of mockery rising from the kitchen. The young errand boy avoided her eyes. At supper, the widow glanced at her coldly and remarked that women of certain age and modesty ought not use words too clever for their station. Confused, the governess endured the silence, pretending not to taste the bitterness of humiliation. That night, she learned the truth. The missing draft had been passed around below stairs, read aloud for amusement. They had mimicked her formal phrasing, her care with words, her quiet effort to sound educated. It should have been nothing, yet the wound ran deep. She had trusted the wrong face, that of the errand boy who had once complimented her hands for being too fine for dust. In the dim candlelight, she realized how fragile her dignity was, dependent entirely on perception, easily stripped away by laughter. She did not cry. Instead, she sat by the window, tracing lines across the misted glass, thinking of her father's hands hammering shoes in rhythm. Work, not pride, had protected him. From that hour on, her kindness acquired caution. Life in the widow's house continued with its familiar patterns: meals measured by bells, letters folded in wax, silence hovering like a curtain. The governess carried herself more uprightly, spoke less, listened more. Inwardly, she began to study people as if they were languages, gestures that hinted at deceit, tones that revealed boredom or vanity. It was in that house that she first learned to read power, not from books, but from pauses. Sometimes, walking through the courtyard after everyone had retired, she would pause by the laundry lines. White linen fluttered like sails above her head, ghostly in the half-light. She imagined herself crossing some invisible sea between poverty and belonging. On the other shore, she pictured a small desk, a room of her own, pupils attentive to her words. Each detail came with guilt, as if desiring comfort was impertinent. By spring, she had grown indispensable. The niece progressed in her lessons and even began translating short prayers from Latin into Spanish. The widow now spoke of her little teacher with faint indulgence. Yet that same indulgence confined her as surely as any chain. There was a ceiling to gratitude, high, polished, unreachable. She kept her humor, though, even as calculation replaced innocence. When asked about her plans, she answered lightly that learning suited her better than marriage. The widow smiled thinly at such remarks, finding them too modern for a young woman of modest means. The governess learned to soften her wit and reserve her laughter for safe company, chiefly herself. The months rolled on. Madrid simmered with gossip of new commerce, of fortunes made and lost after the wars. But within the widow's house, time remained still. Letters went out, lessons resumed, and life folded into repetition. The governess's hands, pale from ink, grew steadier. Her expression learned gentleness that concealed fatigue. She often thought of her childhood courtyard and the honesty of its noise. Here, everything was quieter, yet every whisper carried danger. One dusky afternoon, while clearing the writing desk, she paused over a piece of foreign correspondence addressed to the widow's cousin. Its heading bore neat lines of French script. Out of curiosity, she translated the first lines silently. Polite inquiries about trade and inheritance. As she read, she noticed small inconsistencies. The signature blurred, the phrasing oddly formal. She placed the letter back, disturbed by something she could not name. Moments like these bred reflection. Words, she often thought, carried their own masks. She had trusted a careless one and suffered for it. Others wielded them as weapons, veiling suspicion, securing favor. The widow's house taught her that safety lay not in silence, but in choosing which truths to speak and which to keep folded like unused linens. One morning, the niece handed her a wilted rose taken from the garden, saying she wished lessons could be held among the trees instead of within dusty halls. The governess smiled, perhaps too tenderly, and placed the flower in her book. When it dried, its scent lingered faintly, reminding her of a gentler world she could not return to. When her time in that service ended, without quarrel, without affection, she left carrying only a small trunk, her grammar book, and the quiet knowledge that manners were another form of armor. She stepped into the bright Madrid afternoon, the sound of carriage wheels echoing beyond the alley. Her heart beat fast, both heavy and light, as if the city's air had changed since she first learned its words. In later years, she would recall that period not as hardship, but as apprenticeship, the slow awakening of discernment. Poverty had taught her endurance, this household caution. Between them, she had forged a habit of self-control that would one day guard her from far darker entanglements. Yet all she knew then was this: she would never again leave her words lying unguarded upon a table. The carriage clattered along the cobblestones of Calle del Prado, stirring a faint mist from the previous night's rain. Madrid's morning light, bloomed in yellow and silver, shone through the bare branches of the plane trees and trembled upon the moist stones of the street. Across the narrow facades hung balconies trimmed with wrought iron. Long strips of linen fluttered like idle flags of domestic conquest. Somewhere a street vendor cried out for chestnuts, and the sweet smell mingled with the faint tang of melted wax from nearby churches. She arrived at a large house of sober brick, its wooden shutters drawn half open. The porter, a man in faded livery, gave her a measured glance before guiding her through a vestibule that smelled faintly of lemon polish and sea salt. The air was still, symmetrical, and quiet, the kind of silence that teaches newcomers to speak less than necessary. Her references had preceded her. She came as governess, and as the merchant's wife would soon insist, as a translator for correspondence and occasional papers in French. That addition to her duties pleased her more than she let show. Words had always been her refuge, and now they would be her livelihood. The lady of the house, a woman of delicate features and near-perfect composure, received her with the reserve of someone determined to maintain calm above affection. There was politeness, but little curiosity. The merchant himself greeted her later, tall, severe, marked by the sun from travel. His tone was courteous, his eyes already distracted by thoughts of ledgers and trade routes. His handshake was dry and perfunctory. His wife's perfumed, brief, deliberate. In the day's soft rhythm, the governess began to learn the sounds of her new world, the steady ticking of a wall clock, the faint echo of heels upon the tiled gallery, the whisper of a page turning in the merchant's study. Her pupil, the couple's only daughter, was of tender years, yet spoke French fluently thanks to her mother. The lessons soon became a formality. They spent more time reading fables or listing the names of flowers in 3 languages. The girl adored her at once, without condition, and followed her through the gardens as if through the safest of dreams. At night, the governess occupied a modest chamber under the eaves. Its window overlooked the tiled roofs, and beyond them, the faint outline of the Retiro Park. When wind passed, she could smell damp earth and resin. The hum of the city lulled her to restful, if watchful, sleep. Her duties included assisting the mistress with private correspondence, letters from a French family, an account in Lyon, and the handling of one mysterious package containing a bound book tied with green ribbon. It was heavy, older than the rest, its cover smooth with age. When she handed it over, the lady hesitated. "You read French, do you not?" "Enough to teach it, Signora," the governess replied. The lady paused, fingers resting on the ribbon. "Then perhaps another time. There are passages that require care." It was not until several weeks later that the green-ribboned book reappeared, left quietly upon the governess's writing desk. A small note in delicate script read, "This is a family diary. Please make an inventory of its contents, in Spanish. Begin only if you have the time and the discretion." The governess opened it cautiously that evening. The ink, brown with age, bled into the fragile paper like dried tears. The first page bore a date from decades before, and a name she did not recognize. A. Le Marchand. The handwriting was refined, each word slanted with restrained elegance. She began to translate a few lines. Tales of business ventures, family affairs, references to the early days of the merchant's enterprise. Nothing remarkable, until she came upon a phrase crossed out violently, only half legible. In French it read, "The partner does not yet suspect." She closed the book, unsettled, uncertain whether curiosity was a fault or a duty. Days followed their slow course. Lessons in the morning, correspondence in the afternoon, supper under the discreet warmth of candlelight. The merchant left often for meetings across the city, returning tired and distracted, his clothes bearing the scent of tobacco and ink. The lady spent long hours in her room, sometimes gazing at the diary as though it might accuse her. Once, when the governess entered unannounced, she saw the mistress hastily locking it in a drawer. That evening, reflection came to her as she brushed the dust of the day from her sleeves. Life in this household differed from her previous employments, smoother, but full of invisible threads. Politeness here was armor, service, a form of theater. And yet, its quiet rhythm suited her. There was time for thought, for reading, for the secret, illicit pleasure of discovery. She began the work of translation at night, by the poor light of a lamp. The family slept. Only the muffled steps of the night servant disturbed the stillness. The entries unfolded an older world, trade between Madrid and the colonies, shipments through Cadiz, profits made and debts concealed. And hidden amidst these records were fragments of intimacy, a younger voice describing admiration, jealousy, and guilt. It was in one such entry, near the middle of the book, that she found the name Esteban Marquez. The surname struck her at once, that of her current employer. The lines around it read in a tighter hand, "The last transaction cannot be spoken of. Only one man knows, and his silence has a price." She laid down the pen. The lamp trembled under her breath. In the following days, she carried the knowledge quietly, though it pressed upon her like the idea of an unconfessed sin. The merchant, indifferent as always, crossed her path without noticing. Yet she observed small things. the way his wife's hands trembled when sealing letters, the precise moment he looked away during certain questions at table. Her affection for the daughter kept her steady. The child's laughter softened the tension of the household, turning suspicion into momentary grace. Still, in those early spring weeks, the governess felt herself walking a corridor where every door hid a whisper. One Sunday, the mistress summoned her. The air in the drawing room felt weighed down with perfume and unease. The diary lay upon the chaise, open at the page the governess had marked. "You read this passage?" the woman asked quietly. "I did, only for translation." "And you spoke of it to no one?" "No, Signora." The lady regarded her long, then nodded. "Continue, but do not copy beyond what is asked. The past can disturb more than comfort." Her tone was formal, yet the warning in it was unmistakable. From that moment, a trace of fear accompanied their every exchange. Summer reached Madrid in air thick with dust and distant music. From the open windows, the governess heard accordion tones drifting from the cafes, mingled with fortunes shouted by lottery sellers. Outside the gates, life thrived noisily. Within, quiet softened into secrecy. Sometimes she wondered whether the city itself conspired to hide certain truths, that behind each facade slept histories too complicated for daylight. She pondered how memory becomes property, one person's record, another's ruin. At night, she dreamt of her father's tools, their sure visible purpose, and woke to the ache of moral uncertainty. Words, once her comfort, had turned treacherous. By the end of that summer, the merchant's business had grown restless. Letters arrived from Cadiz with seals already broken. Conversation ceased when she entered a room. The mistress grew pale, her step unsteady. Small fears fused into tension so complete it filled even the silence between them. The diary's pages thinned toward the end, the handwriting changing again, uneven, hurried, as though written in flight. One last line, simple yet chilling, appeared in French. "He will not forgive me. His silence is death." She stopped there. A chill traveled up her spine. Outside, in the deep Madrid night, a carriage rolled over the stones, echo fading into the fog. In the adjacent room, the young girl breathed in her sleep, unaware that her cradle stood upon history's unmarked grave. The governess trimmed her lamp and let darkness reclaim the room. The diary lay closed beside her, a quiet weight beside a heavier thought. Knowledge, once gained, cannot be unlearned. And from that point onward, she sensed that whatever peace this house promised had already begun to unravel in secret. The courtyard of the house glowed pale under late autumn sunlight, its well framed by orange trees heavy with dust. Days had shortened, the lamps were lit before supper, and smoke coiled upward through the tiled roofs. The governess often passed along that courtyard at dusk, a shawl around her shoulders, aware that something in the air had turned uncertain. Conversation within the household had grown careful. On certain evenings, the servants whispered in corners, as if the walls themselves might overhear. Inside, life continued with its quiet repetitions. The child studied diligently, her handwriting improving beneath the governess's steady guidance. Lessons in French alternated with walks through the gallery, where the girl liked to count the portraits of long-dead relatives. They gazed down from their gilded frames with expressions of stern advantage, men in powdered wigs, women in satin and pearls, all seemingly untouched by the years that had changed everything outside their painted air. The governess maintained composure, though weariness had crept into her mind. That diary, her nightly occupation, had begun to weigh upon her more than she wished to admit. The further she read, the more the text seemed to darken. The entries became erratic, notes about unpaid debts, a letter gone missing, a partner who grew inconvenient. Each word felt both ordinary and dangerous. Translation had always seemed to her a bridge between minds. Now it felt like trespassing into the forbidden. One afternoon, while she sat copying out a passage, she caught sight of the merchant standing silently in the doorway. His face betrayed nothing. After a pause, he asked evenly, "You work late, señorita?" "I find the air quieter at these hours," she replied, closing the book slightly. He nodded once and left. The echo of his boots down the corridor lingered long after. Later that night she returned to the sentence she had been transcribing. It spoke of a dispute over profit. A man's name crossed out, a date smudged with water stains. Below the line another note appeared, in fainter ink. "If this is discovered, all is lost." She set down the quill and looked to the window where street lamps were reflected like small suns in puddles. A stray cat moved across the sill. For the first time, she wondered whether her task might invite consequences her modest wage could never balance. As days passed, she noticed subtle movements in the household. Drawers left half open, conversations breaking off when she entered, letters hurriedly sealed. The mistress seemed increasingly fragile, her complexion drained of color. During breakfast, she avoided her husband's gaze. The merchant's tone had grown curt, yet his politeness remained exact. Something between them had turned brittle, like porcelain beginning to crack. Every afternoon, when lessons ended, the governess walked to market for ink and paper. Those narrow streets were her brief escape. Stalls of fruit dark with dust, vendors calling out their wares, women bargaining in rapid Spanish, priests crossing themselves as carriages splashed through the mud. The noise acted like a balm. She returned home calmer, though the calm never lasted beyond sunset. One evening, the maid from the upper floor approached her in secret. The girl's breath trembled. "Señorita," she said softly, "do not leave your things unlocked." The master looks through drawers when he thinks the house is asleep. The governess did not show alarm. She only thanked the girl and offered half a coin for her discretion. But after the maid slipped away, fear bloomed quietly in her chest. That night she placed the diary under a loose floorboard and slept restlessly, hearing footsteps in the hall, too slow to be mere wandering. Weeks drifted by in that strange balance between suspicion and duty. The young pupil continued her studies, innocent of the shifting ground around her. Her laughter, bright and untroubled, pierced the stillness like a bird's song in a tomb. The governess loved the child's trust and dreaded it equally. Teaching her became both privilege and refuge, as though innocence could devour the shadows if tended long enough. One morning in early winter, a visitor arrived, a man in plain black, neither noble nor poor, with a manner of understated authority. He was shown to the merchant's study. The meeting lasted an hour, and when the man departed, the merchant remained inside, pacing heavily. Later, the governess heard whispers among the cooks that he served the city's guards, a man who asked too many questions about old matters. That evening, during a lesson in French composition, the lady of the house entered unexpectedly. Her smile was thin, her fingertips trembling as she adjusted a bow on her daughter's dress. Then quietly, she asked the governess to walk with her. They went into the corridor, where the scent of candle wax hung thick in the still air. "You have been assisting me with the diary," the lady began gently. "Continue, but hide nothing from me. If you find mention of a man named Lemas or Le Marchand, tell me at once." The governess agreed, though hesitation caught in her throat. As they parted, she understood what the merchant's composure hid: fear, perhaps not of discovery, but of memory returned. From that night forward, she translated more slowly, weighing every phrase as if each could ignite something. The diary's lines no longer sounded like confession, but like warning. She copied passages onto clean sheets, but left blank the ones she did not dare transcribe. Among them lay a fragment describing a debt settled by accident, the words half erased under a blot of water. Sometimes, when sleep evaded her, she imagined the events the diary only suggested. Faces she had never seen took shape. A partnership betrayed, a meeting by lantern light, perhaps a quarrel that ended in more than words. The images came unbidden, and though she chastised herself for invention, truth seemed closer to imagination than to silence. Winter deepened. Frost edged the windows of her attic room. She read by candlelight wrapped in her old shawl, the same she had owned when leaving her parents' house. The city below felt far away, its music, its laughter, its taverns of warmth. The world narrowed to ink, breath, and the creak of timbers shifting in the cold. One night, returning from the kitchen, she found her room's lock forced and the floorboard slightly raised. The diary was still there, yet a few pages bore marks from unfamiliar hands. Panic grew slowly rather than sharply. She replaced the book and sat for a long time without moving. By morning, she resolved to keep a copy hidden elsewhere. She would not accuse, not yet, but she felt the net around her tighten. Weeks later, the merchant left for Cadiz on business. The atmosphere lightened. The lady smiled more freely. Servants seemed less cautious. The governess resumed lessons and began translating once more in the evenings, determined to finish before his return. Yet the diary resisted completion. Each new page tangled the story further. An entry near the end caught her breath. It spoke of a meeting near the harbor, the partners' protest, and the fall that silenced it. The final word trailed off, unfinished, as if interrupted by fear or guilt. For a long time she stared at the sentence, until the ink blurred in her tears, perhaps of pity, perhaps of resignation. The next day, she brought the translated pages to the mistress's chamber. The woman sat by the fire, her eyes hollow but attentive. She read silently, one hand clutched to her throat. When she looked up, her voice shook. "So it was true after all. He never told me." The governess lowered her gaze. "Should I continue?" "No," said the lady, folding the papers carefully. "Not now. What is already known cannot be undone." As she left the chamber, the governess felt a strange stillness settle over her. Knowledge had finally touched its boundary, that fragile space where truth ceases to serve and begins to wound. In her mind flickered the words she had once learned as a girl: veritas, truth; timor, fear. The two seemed at last inseparable. That night, silence reigned in the house. The fire burned low. From the corridors drifted only the faint sound of the city outside, breathing through the shutters. She sat at her desk, her hands dark with ink, her thoughts heavier than fatigue. The diary lay closed before her, yet its voice continued, whispering through memory and conscience alike. She rose, extinguished the lamp, and stood by the window. Madrid slept under a pale fog, and the stars were blurred as if seen through tears. Somewhere a church bell tolled once, a low sound fading over the roofs. She pressed her hand to the cold glass and thought that the truth, once revealed even partly, leaves neither victor nor peace, only awareness, quiet and irreversible, like the spreading trace of ink upon paper. Late winter came quietly, edging through the courtyards with brittle wind and thin light. The house on Calle del Prado smelled of damp wood and coal smoke. Candles burned quicker in the chill, their wax trembling under invisible drafts. The governess wrapped herself in wool and kept to her tasks, yet something in her movements betrayed exhaustion. The diary had at last been locked away, or so she had been told, but its shadow lingered in every room, like perfume that refused to fade. The merchant had returned from Cadiz. His presence filled the house again, his deliberate tread across polished floors, his voice rising through the corridors when servants delayed, the measured silence that followed after conversation. He carried new papers tied with ribbon, and the governess overheard mention of old debts, unfinished contracts, letters requiring correction. She recognized the tone of a man who tends to matters thicker than commerce. The lady of the house appeared more fragile than before. She often remained in her chamber after meals, her shawl pulled close, eyes fixed upon some private distance. The governess visited with the child for short reading lessons, gentle ones now, designed to soothe rather than instruct. Verses about angels, or fables in which kindness triumphed over cunning. The little girl read them with devotion, unaware how near cruelty sometimes stood to her home. Madrid itself seemed wrapped in a wearied calm. The war years were over, but echoes persisted in scars, and stories whispered at taverns. Prices of bread rose again. In the evenings, the glow of lamps down Calle de Leon reminded her of 100 other lives, quietly enduring. Sometimes she paused under the colonnade of the church, her gloved fingers stiff from cold, and envied those whose hearts were occupied by nothing graver than tomorrow's wages. When she returned home, the windows were always lit. There were nights when the merchant's voice carried faintly even to her room, not in anger, but with a hardness that made her flinch without meaning to. She seldom slept before midnight, and grew accustomed to walking the corridors in silence before dawn, when all lamps faded. It was during one such morning round that she noticed a faint odor of smoke. It came not from the hearth, but from somewhere near the back pantry. She pushed open the door and felt warmth on her face. A cloth had caught fire on the edge of the stove, the flames already licking up the wall. She called for help. Servants rushed in, buckets clattered, shouts rose, and in moments the fire was beaten down. No one was harmed, but the commotion flooded every corner of the house. In the confusion, something passed almost unseen. The merchant descending from his study, coat hastily drawn, a sheaf of papers pressed close to his chest. Later, when the smoke had thinned, the governess realized that part of the ledger shelf was gone, charred into black fragments. "Old receipts," he said briskly, waving off concern. "The heat spread quickly. Nothing of worth." yet his attempt at indifference looked rehearsed, like a man repeating consolations to himself. That evening, the mistress collapsed into her chair by the fire and wept without warning. The child clung to her skirts, frightened by tears that refused to explain themselves. The governess comforted them both and thought, not unkindly, that grief often resembled guilt. 2 days later came a visitor, the same quiet man who had once been received in the merchant's study. He returned now under a gentler excuse, inquiries from the city guard about an older commercial case, an estate unsettled after a partner's death years earlier. The merchant greeted him in the vestibule with elaborate civility, insisting the matter was trivial. Yet the governess, standing in the gallery above, saw him pale when the man mentioned the name Le Marchand. The following morning she found the merchant's wife in her sitting room, holding a sealed envelope. "He left for the notary," the lady whispered, her voice brittle. "He said he might be delayed." She gestured toward the envelope as though it burned her fingers. "Will you read this for me?" The governess hesitated, then obeyed. Inside was a note written in cramped script, half in Spanish, half in French, her employer's hand. It spoke briefly of pending matters clarified and certain records adjusted. There was also a sentence scrawled hastily along the margin. "The diary must vanish. It can harm more than protect." The governess folded the paper and placed it back in silence. The lady covered her face with both hands. They said nothing further, for what words could one choose when truth itself pressed against the walls? That night brought heavy rain. The governess lay awake, listening to water hammer the roof. Lightning flared. For a moment the beams above her glistened like wet bone. A noise below drew her from bed. Footsteps hurried, uneven. She dressed quickly and descended the stair just in time to see the merchant leaving through the side door, hat pulled low, cloak over his arm. The door shut behind him with a dull thud. She waited, heart trembling, until silence returned. He did not come back for 2 days. By the time he did, his complexion was ashen. She overheard from the maid that he had been seen near the Manzanares Bridge in secret company. No one knew with whom. The maid also said that the guards had called again during his absence. The household now lived in suspense, pretending normalcy to conceal deeper dread. The governess kept to her place, observant, discreet. She continued tutoring, although her mind wandered constantly toward the diary hidden in her chamber. She still possessed the translated copy she had made, an incomplete record of another man's guilt. She sometimes considered destroying it, but each time her hand faltered. To erase it seemed a betrayal of conscience. To keep it, a danger. As winter deepened, she noticed how every small comfort, a candle flame, a child's laughter, a loaf fresh from the oven, grew more precious. Perhaps danger made tenderness visible. The city's air smelled of rain and hardship, yet her heart, strained as it was, held a measure of strength she had not known in younger years. One evening the merchant summoned her. The study was unusually cold. The window shutters remained open to the drizzle. He stood by the desk, sorting papers into piles that seemed to multiply under his hand. Without looking up, he asked, "You have worked here near 2 years, have you not?" She nodded. "You have taught my daughter well." A long pause. "You read, you write, and you keep silent." He turned then, his gaze steady but hollow. "Tell me, do you believe a woman's curiosity a virtue or a peril?" She met his eyes briefly. "Perhaps both. The difference lies in what she discovers. His mouth twitched as though to smile, but no smile came. Indeed. He dismissed her with a gesture, yet as she reached the door he added, "For everyone's sake, forget what you read. Some stories end better untold." That night, despair replaced fear. She sensed his warning was part confession, part threat. Duty chained her to silence, yet justice whispered otherwise. A small rebellion stirred within her, not of anger but of conscience, the same quiet force that had driven her to learn letters by candlelight as a child. The following afternoon she met the same city guard by chance at the apothecary, standing under the awning as rain drenched the street. Their glances crossed. He recognized her but said nothing. On impulse, she bowed slightly and murmured, "Sometimes books tell more than they should." He inclined his head, neither surprise nor question in his eyes. Then he stepped away into the downpour. That evening the merchant ate alone. His wife dined in silence upstairs. The child was sent early to bed. Servants moved cautiously, avoiding sudden speech. Just after 10, thunder rolled close enough to rattle the ceiling. The governess sat at her desk, hearing the rhythm of rain and far-off bells. Suddenly, a new smell reached her, not of damp, but of burnt tallow. She rushed down and found the pantry still scarred black from the old fire, a faint wisp of smoke rising again, though no flame yet showed. She called for help once more. By the time the servants gathered, the smoke had faded. Strangely, one window stood open, though the wind blew rain inside. None could explain who had opened it. The governess peered out into the alley, nothing but rain swallowing light. Somewhere a door slammed, somewhere else perhaps an ending began. A week later, word spread quietly through the house. A man matching the merchant's description had been questioned by authorities about an incident of long ago, a dispute ending in another's disappearance. He denied all. The mistress refused visitors, and the staff went about murmuring as if in mourning, though no one had died. The governess kept her silence, her soul torn between pity and justice. On her desk, the copied pages of the diary rested under glass, safe from damp hands and conscience alike. She told herself that she would know when to act, that truth, once ready, revealed its own hour. Outside, Madrid turned toward spring. But in that house, the air remained heavy with smoke, unburned stories, and the haunting certainty that one wrong remained unanswered. Wind swept the tiled roofs of Madrid with sudden violence, slamming the shutters in the upper galleries of Calle del Prado. The governess had been ill for several days, her voice reduced to a thin whisper. Yet she persisted in her lessons. The child read softly by the fire, wrapped in a shawl, while her guardian corrected from silence. The household itself moved as if without breath. Servants spoke in half-tones, footsteps slowed, and every sound seemed drawn inward into waiting. The merchant had returned from his questioning, but appeared unlike the man he had been. The neat precision of his dress remained, yet the confidence beneath dissolved. He walked as though the ground had thinned beneath him. Each morning he retreated to his study, refusing meals until late evening. The mistress observed him with both pity and dread, and the governess could almost see the invisible rope binding them together. Two lives chained by knowledge neither dared name aloud. For her part, the governess sensed the approach of a finish. The diary, copied and concealed, weighed more each day. Though it hid behind glass and wooden planks, its presence filled her small chamber like a second heartbeat. Her conscience had turned restless. Silence protected her, yet that same silence had become a cage. One gray afternoon, when the air crackled before rain, the merchant's wife sent for her. The summons felt solemn somehow, too quiet to be routine. The governess found her seated by the window, a letter in hand. "He spoke last night to one of the guards," the lady said, her eyes fixed on the street below. "They know. They cannot prove, unless someone gives them the words." The governess understood instantly. "The diary." The lady nodded. "In those pages," she whispered, "lies both guilt and mercy. It tells of another's end, and of my husband's silence that followed." Neither moved for a time. Then the lady asked softly, "You kept a copy?" The governess hesitated before answering. "Yes." "Then you must decide, not I." "If truth comes into air now, it will unmake everything, for my child, for us all." When she left the room, the governess carried no more certainty than before, yet she knew her patience had reached its end. That night, she opened the hidden drawer and read the final translated passage once again. The handwriting in the original faltered near its close, as though the author's hand had trembled. It described a meeting by the port, a quarrel about an unpaid debt, the sound of a struggle followed by silence broken only by the sea, then a final, unfinished line. "The partner fell, and I—" Nothing after that. The next page was blank. She sat upright long after the lamps had burned to wax shadows. The words before her blurred until they became shapes, symbols without breath, reminders only of pain. Moral clarity, she thought, was not light but fire. It destroyed as it revealed. The next morning brought pale skies and raw sunlight. Without her shawl, she walked to the small office near the cathedral, where the same civil guard received complaints and statements. The streets smelled of damp fruit and horse sweat. At the desk, she asked for the investigator by name. He emerged after a few minutes, face calm but alert, as if expecting her. "Señorita," he said politely, "there is nothing more to ask of your employer. The past is too faded for justice." "Sometimes the past will not stay there," she replied, and produced the folded manuscript. Her fingers quivered slightly as she placed it down. "This translation mirrors the original, though not entire. Read what remains. It may be enough." She turned and left before he could speak again. By the time she reached the house, the merchant had already discovered her absence. He met her at the vestibule, hands clasped behind his back. "You went out early," he said quietly. "To prayer," she answered, though her eyes betrayed no lie, only fatigue. He nodded but studied her long. "When one holds another's secret," he said, "it is well to remember that even truth requires permission." Then he passed by her without another word. The hours that followed passed with the grace of mercy withheld. At dusk, servants began whispering, guards returning, questions, documents examined. The merchant locked himself in the study. The governess resumed teaching the child as if nothing beyond grammar existed, yet her pulse echoed through her temples like a clock wound too tight. By evening, a messenger arrived with sealed orders. The mistress read them pale and silent. When she looked up, her eyes searched the governess's face for something between gratitude and betrayal, but found neither. Only calm. That night, without warning, the guards entered the house, their hats dripping rain. The merchant came down the stairs composed, even courteous, his coat immaculate. "There is no need for alarm," he told his wife, gently removing her hands from his arm. "I will clarify the matter." The governess later remembered how that moment felt stretched beyond time. The child watching from the rail above, the servants frozen mid-step, the rain outside sharpening every sound. The man descended without resistance and vanished through the open door, leaving behind only the odor of wet wool and smoke from the hall lamps. Silence followed long afterward, a silence that seeped into every breath. The mistress asked for wine and did not drink it. The child cried herself to sleep. And the governess, standing beside the cold hearth, realized the meaning of justice, not triumph, but stillness. The house breathed again only toward morning, when the light filtered through curtains with the same indifference it had shown the day before. 3 days later, letters arrived bearing official stamps. The merchant had confessed before witnesses, claiming the death had been accidental, that greed and fear had mixed too easily in youth. He was to be released under watch, but would never return to Madrid. The case, in bureaucratic terms, was closed. The governess, summoned privately by the lady, entered the chamber where daylight hollowed the drapes. "You did what conscience demanded," the mistress said, her voice both faint and composed. "He might have run forever. Now there is at least an ending." She extended a small purse of coins, all that could be offered without shame. "You cannot remain," she added. "They will blame you quietly, if not aloud." The governess accepted the dismissal without protest. That evening she packed her trunk, pausing only to touch the child's sleeping hand, a gesture lighter than farewell. The house stood still around her, its polished walls stripped of illusion. She left by dawn, her steps echoing down the wet streets. Outside, Madrid glimmered under washed skies. Carriages splashed through puddles. Bells called the faithful to morning mass. The city cared nothing for private reckonings. She moved through its waking rhythm, uncertain of direction, but no longer afraid. At the first corner, she rested by a closed shop window. Her reflection looked older, calmer. Behind her eyes lingered a question without answer, whether truth had freed anyone or merely unburdened itself upon the innocent. Yet somewhere deep inside, a lighter thought stirred, that clarity, even painful, bore its own quiet mercy. She adjusted her gloves, lifted her trunk, and walked on. Words, after all, could destroy, but they could also name the world back into sense, and that, she thought, was reason enough to keep speaking, though the speaking must often be done in silence. The city woke under a pale sky, its rooftops still wet from early rain. In a narrow apartment above a printer's workshop, the governess sat before a small table covered with scraps of paper and blue ink stains. She had not worn silk in many months. Her dresses now bore the simplicity of necessity. The window before her opened onto Calle de Lavapiés, where laundries swung like flags of surrender between windows, and the cries of street vendors drifted upward with the smell of onions and wax. Here, life had condensed to habit. Each morning she taught reading and arithmetic to the sons of clerks, the kind of boys who would one day copy ledgers and bow at counters, their futures already lettered in neat columns. She corrected their notebooks patiently, Her discipline was gentle because she saw in their faces the same hunger that had once driven her. Sometimes, between lessons, she translated short documents for lawyers or merchants, contracts, receipts, even a pamphlet on foreign trade. Her knowledge of French had become her bread. Words no longer carried danger, only the taste of work well done. Yet at times, as she arranged the phrases of another man's business, an old memory stirred. The sound of the sea, hidden within the diary's pages, the faint scent of smoke from that house, and the echoing tread of boots on marble steps. Evenings passed quietly. She ate alone by lamplight, a crust of bread, a cup of broth, sometimes an orange if the market was kind. The apartment's thin walls echoed with neighbors' lives, laughter, quarrels, a baby's cry, the musician practicing scales in the room below. All of it wove into a comfort made from proximity without intrusion. Poverty no longer humiliated her. It had taught her the art of sufficiency. One late autumn night, she began a letter she did not plan to send. The paper trembled slightly under her pen. "My dear child," it began, for she could not bring herself to name the merchant's daughter. The words came haltingly. She wrote of the lessons they had shared, of fairy tales read at dusk, of small conversations that had saved her from loneliness. Then she paused, realizing that she was not writing to the child at all, but to the memory of her own youth, to the quiet, trustful girl she had once been. The room seemed to fill with her younger self's questions, the same ones that had followed her through every household. Why must truth hurt the gentle? Why does silence grow from kindness? She continued writing even as the light dimmed. The letter unfolded like a confession disguised as advice. That courage was not a matter of rebellion but of endurance. That forgiveness could exist without forgetting. And that understanding one's limits was also a form of wisdom. When she at last folded the paper, sealing it with wax from her candle, she placed it in a box of sewing needles and old coins. Some messages, she thought, belong only to the act of writing. Days blended into one another with calm monotony. The cold months passed more mercifully this year. She no longer waited for fortune, only for morning light to return through her window at its familiar hour. The death of the merchant reached her not directly, but through the newspaper. A tiny notice between reports of failed crops and government decrees. It said simply that Esteban Marquez had died overseas of fever. She read the line twice, then folded the page. The tremor that ran through her was brief and final, a sigh more than a shudder. That evening she walked farther than usual after work, down toward the river where the lamps shimmered upon the dark water. The city's hum wrapped around her like the murmuring of distant prayers. She thought of him not as villain nor victim, but as a man too proud to be innocent. Above all, she thought of the child he had left behind, safe, she hoped, still believing the world a clear and generous place. In that wish rested her quiet absolution. Returning home, she met her landlord's wife on the stairs, a rosy woman with kind laughter. They spoke of small troubles, the rising cost of flour, a neighbor's illness, a lost cat, and it comforted her more than she expected. Humanity, she realized, dwelled not in great acts, but in shared complaints and the gentle endurance of ordinary hours. Winter returned and passed. Her translation work increased, modest pay accumulating in careful piles. With time, she bought another lamp for her table and a second pair of shoes. She even allowed herself a canary in a cage, yellow as candlelight, always restless, filling the room with a chirping that refused to spare. Once a week, she visited a nearby church, not to pray for salvation, but to listen to the echo of footsteps beneath the high vaults, as if the building remembered its visitors more faithfully than God remembered their words. One afternoon in early spring, while copying a legal letter, she paused mid-sentence. The phrase before her, "obligations transferred herewith," struck her as painfully human. Obligations. All her life had been built upon them, to her parents, her employers, her pupils, her own conscience. Freedom, she saw now, was not an escape from duty, but its quiet transformation into choice. She smiled faintly and finished the letter. As months rolled on, she grew used to solitude the way a tree accepts wind, bending enough to survive without breaking. On Sundays, she sometimes walked through the botanical garden, where the scent of soil and rain revived old sensations. Beneath its cypress trees, she watched children chasing pigeons, their laughter carrying a note of innocence she no longer sought to recover. Life, stripped of illusions, had regained its modest beauty. One evening, overhearing a group of students outside the workshop debating politics, she heard one quote a line from Montaigne in halting Spanish. She smiled at their earnestness. Standing by her window later, she repeated the same line in French, slowly, letting the words roll from her tongue like a remembered prayer. It was then she understood that she had not lost language, but made it her home. The world within words was safer than any house of brick. That night she dreamed of the sea. She saw waves washing over an ink-smudged book abandoned on a shore. When she awoke, the dream left her with no sorrow. Some truths, she thought, are meant to drown, so the living may go on without bitterness. In the following months, she continued teaching. Her pupils came and went. The canary sang as always. Occasionally, a family hired her to translate a letter from abroad. At such times, she breathed the scent of ink and paper as one breathes air, with quiet gratitude. Each new document reminded her that every life, no matter how small, left a trail of sentences to be deciphered by someone else. She never sent the letter hidden in her sewing box, nor did she destroy it. It remained there through seasons turning, folded like a pressed flower one cannot discard. Years later, perhaps someone would find it and wonder to whom it was meant, never guessing it had been written to no one at all. Sometimes at sunset she opened her window. The air carried the smell of bread from the bakery below, and the city seemed warmer then, its voices softened by dusk. She would stand quietly, feeling Madrid's pulse beneath the hum of carriages and children's chatter. In that moment, her life, with all its sorrows and regrets, felt rightly measured, not extraordinary, not wasted, only lived. The bell from a distant church would sound, and she, without thinking, would whisper a word in French, espérance, hope. She had learned long ago that the gentlest form of courage was simply to rise each morning and believe, however faintly, that the day might still hold kindness. And so she lived, neither saint nor sinner, the keeper of a story she no longer needed to tell. In her final dwelling, the rooms were brighter. It stood at the top of a low house near the Plaza de Anton Martin, its terrace shaded with vines that caught the afternoon wind and scattered specks of sunlight across the tiles. The governess, now no one's servant and everyone's neighbor, had grown used to the hum of the street below, the clatter of carts, the laughter from the bakery opposite, and the faint toll of bells that marked the hours. Her teaching continued, though less frequently. The children of tradesmen came in pairs to read to her by the window. Their voices stumbled over syllables. Their fingers smudged ink. Their curiosity burned quick and bright. She guided them with patience drawn from long practice, watching their understanding bloom and fade like the rhythm of breath. When they left, the silence that followed felt not empty, but whole, as if the room itself exhaled satisfaction. After lessons, she would step onto the terrace to tend her herbs. Mint, sage, rosemary, and thyme, each brought from the marketplace, each thriving with unexpected vigor. Their scent filled the air when warm winds came from the south. She had little else to care for but these plants, a cat who guarded them jealously, and the few visiting friends who shared her simple suppers of lentils, cheese, and bread. Her life no longer turned around secrets or duties, only the texture of passing days. Yet sometimes, while watering the plants at dusk, memory returned uninvited. It came in fragments. A girl's laughter that used to echo through a marble corridor, pages turning under candlelight, the cry of a child frightened by smoke, the sound of a confession spoken too late. She no longer resisted such recollections. They had softened with time, losing their sting. Nothing from that house on Calle del Prado could harm her now. One afternoon she received a letter written in careful handwriting. It came from another city, a coastal one, judging by the rough paper scented faintly of salt. The writer introduced herself as the daughter of Don Esteban, asking if the governess still lived in Madrid, and remembering her as the gentlest voice of my childhood. The letter carried gratitude, but also confusion. She wished to know whether the stories told after her father's death were true. The governess read it twice, folded it gently, and set it by the window to catch the light. That evening she answered without hesitation, but with deliberate restraint. Her reply spoke of education, of kindness, of lessons learned from solitude. It said nothing of guilt, betrayal, or confession. She wrote, "Your father loved you very much, and that love remains the truest part of all things that happened." There was honesty in that line, though it omitted much. She sealed the letter, untroubled by what it left unsaid. Some silences, she had learned, are not deceit, but mercy. The days lengthened as spring deepened into early summer. The terrace became her sanctuary. Pigeons landed near her feet without fear. A stray dog sometimes joined her at dusk, gazing at the rooftops as though also listening to the invisible city breathing below. The air filled with faint music from taverns. Guitar strings touched lightly, the murmur of voices softened by distance. From her vantage, Madrid seemed peaceful, its hard corners dissolved by evening light. Her own body had begun to slow. The joints that once bent easily now protested each morning. Still, she managed her little household. She swept the floor before sunrise, polished the brass lamp, sorted her paper scraps for reuse. Her handwriting, though smaller, remained graceful. Sometimes she smiled at how perfectly ordinary her days had become. After years of service, lived in fear and obedience, the simplicity of routine felt like a miracle no priest could bless more fully. Now and then she would think of her parents, long gone. Their labor had been constant, Yet in work they had found a certain dignity she had once misunderstood. Labor, she realized, had never been punishment. It was belonging to the world through action. That thought returned often when she rubbed oil into the handles of her tools or mended torn stockings. Each gesture felt like a quiet act of repair toward existence itself. One evening, she invited an old friend, a seamstress from the next street, to share coffee on the terrace. The two women sat watching the last streaks of light fade over the rooftops. They spoke little, conversing instead in the way of those who no longer compete with silence. The seamstress recounted city gossip, a new theater, a rumor of revolution, the price of candles rising again. The governess listened with gentle amusement. Such talk reminded her that life, ever restless, had finally learned to pass her by without cruelty. When her guest departed, she remained seated, listening to the rhythms of the night, the neigh of a distant horse, the percussion of buckets being filled, the sigh of shutters closing. A single lamp flickered inside her room, its glow spilling through the open door onto the terrace tiles. She thought how strange it was that contentment could arrive so quietly. No revelation, no great joy, only absence of fear. It was as though peace had been waiting all along, too modest to announce itself. As weeks slipped by, she began writing again, not diaries or translations, but fragments without destination, observations of people in the marketplace, tales overheard by tavern windows, notes on the changing hue of sky before rain. She wrote these things on thin sheets kept under her ink bottle. Writing had ceased to serve others. It now served memory alone, a way to preserve her days for herself rather than history. One note read, "Happiness is the slow recognition that nothing more is owed to you." Another, "Kindness is memory without claim." And beneath them both, she scribbled an old Latin phrase she had once taught a child long ago, "Amare, credere, sperare," to love, to believe, to hope. The three verbs that had followed her from the beginning now returned, gentler, familiar as friends. The final summer she spent in that house was her most peaceful. The rooftop plants bloomed wildly, their scent drifting into neighboring homes. Children sometimes shouted greetings from stairways below. She answered with a smile or a wave of her handkerchief. To them, she was simply La Señora del Tejado, the woman of the rooftop. It suited her perfectly. Late one night, unable to sleep, she carried her lamp to the terrace. The air was warm, heavy with the perfume of jasmine. Stars shimmered faintly above the cramped roofs. She sat, listening to the city breathe, and thought how much it had changed since the days of her youth. Yet she felt no distance from it. The Madrid beyond her railing, the markets, the cobblers, the governesses and clerks, was still her own. The world had broken and mended itself countless times, just as she had. The lamplight caught her papers on the table nearby. She rearranged them, smiling at the uneven lines, the forgotten corners of unfinished sentences, all the tiny evidences of a life quietly witnessed rather than proclaimed. When dawn came, she rose to make tea. The first light spread across the courtyard and touched the vines. Below, a baker opened his door, and the smell of rising dough filled the air. She leaned on the rail and whispered softly a line she had copied from a French book and never forgotten. La clarté du matin ne juge personne. The clarity of morning judges no one. As the city awakened beneath her, she felt only gratitude for language learned, for kindness remembered, for the infinite mercy of ordinary things. The world had never owed her more than it gave, and that, at last, was enough. The kettle sang inside. She turned toward its sound, her shadow moving gently over the terrace tiles like a leaf in sunlight. Behind her, the vines rustled with wind, carrying further than she would ever know the scent of time and ink, the faint trace of a life lived quietly, but well.